Well, tonight we do continue our study in the book of Ruth, and we're going to focus in on Ruth chapter 1, verses 11 through 16. There are 4 acts in the book of Ruth. They actually correspond to the 4 chapters, which makes it easy. And act number 1 is actually called Death and Emptiness. It's not a great way to start the book, but that's the way the book begins. We're introduced in this first act to the main characters. We're also introduced to the main problems that need a resolution, and we'll talk about those in a moment. It's fascinating that this chapter begins and ends in Bethlehem, although most of the action in this chapter takes place either in Moab or on the way back from Moab to Bethlehem. We've looked at scene 1 a couple of weeks ago, and that was the trip from Bethlehem to Moab. And this is where the book begins as a tragedy. It's a story of an Israelite family. The husband's name is Elimelech. The wife's name is Naomi. They have 2 children. And the story begins with a famine in the land of Israel, especially where they live in Bethlehem in the tribe of Judah. And apparently the famine has impacted most, if not all, of Israel because they choose to leave their own country, the land of Israel, and they go to the land of Moab because they hear that there's food in Moab. They get to Moab, and we're not sure how long they were there, but Elimelech dies. We're not told why, we're simply told that he dies. The 2 sons are now of marriageable age, and so living in the land of Moab, they marry Moabite women. No real surprise, most of the women in Moab are Moabites. And so they marry these 2 women named Orpah and Ruth. About 10 years later, both of the boys die. And during those 10 years of marriage, neither couple produces a child. They were, especially in the ancient world, looking for a son, but no son was born. The main character in this story is Naomi. And from her perspective, her husband is dead. Her 2 sons are dead, and she's living in a foreign country with no one really to take care of her. Back in the ancient world, if you were a woman, your husband took care of you. And if your husband happened to pass away, your sons would take care of you. At least you hope that your sons would take care of you. And she's left with no one. There's also the family line. There's no one to carry on the family line because in 5 verses, all the males die. And the only 3 characters left are Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, which happen to be Orpah and Ruth. So it's an absolute tragedy at this point. We move to scene 2, which is the return from Moab to Bethlehem. And in this scene, there are 3 conversations that are going to take place between Naomi and her daughters-in-law. It's interesting, at this point in the story, it moves from simply a narrative to dialogue between the characters. So we actually get to hear the characters speak, which gives us great insight to what's going on inside of them, what they're thinking, and what might be in their heart. And in this particular scene 2, there are 3 such dialogues. Naomi's going to give the main speech in all 3. She begins by talking to her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and she addresses them as one, and they both decide at the end of verse 10 that they are one and they're not going anywhere. So Naomi gives another speech in verses 11 through 14, and we're going to look at that tonight, but this time Orpah and Ruth both have to make an individual decision. Do I stay with Naomi, or do I stay in my home country of Moab? And we're going to look at their decisions tonight. Then in that 3rd conversation, Naomi and Ruth are now together. They've become one. And Orpah is now on the outside. She's marginalized. In fact, she's going to leave the story. So, last week we looked at conversation number 1. And conversation, again, number 1, is talking about Naomi and the 2 daughters-in-law. And Naomi finds out in verse 6 that there's food in Israel. So it's safe to go back to the land of Israel. And it looks like since they've been there for over 10 years, they were happy in Moab. Well, until all the guys died. And now that all the men are dead, they decide things are not so great anymore. Maybe we should go back to Israel. So in verse 7, that's what they decide to do. They're going back to the land of Bethlehem, to the tribe of Judah. So they're going to make this journey that we talked about from Moab. They need to go north of the Dead Sea because they can't cross it. They'll actually cross the Jordan River, which flows into the Dead Sea, and eventually end up back in Bethlehem. It's about 75 miles. Several days they should be able to walk and get there. Then Naomi decides all of a sudden, because it looks like all three of them are going back to Bethlehem. But then Naomi decides in verses 8 and 9 that maybe it's not such a good idea for these two young widows to accompany her back to the land of Israel. Maybe it would be best for them to stay in the land of Moab, return to their family's home, and look for new husbands and start life again in Moab. So she tries to convince them to go back home. And there's this incredible scene in verse 9 where there's a lot of weeping, a lot of wailing, a lot of mourning, and it looks like at that point that these two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, are going to go back home, and Naomi's going to make the journey all by herself to the land of Israel. But in verse 10, surprise, both girls decide, we're not going anywhere. We're staying with you, Naomi. So her first speech ends in, well, from her perspective, failure. She hasn't convinced anybody to do anything, which means she's not about to give up. So there is conversation number 2 in verses 11 through 14, and Naomi once again will try to convince Orpah and Ruth to stay in Moab and let her return to Israel by herself. Well, this second speech happens to be Naomi's longest speech in the entire story. And this time in her speech, she's going to try 3 times to try to convince them to return to their homeland and just separate from her. It would be best for them if they stayed in Moab. So let's look at those, because 3 times she's going to address them. And in all 3 arguments, she begins by telling them what she wants them to do. And so she says, Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters." In other words, don't stay with me. Go back home, go back to your parents, start your life all over again. And verse 11 begins with the connecting word "but," because in verse 10, Orpah and Ruth have already decided they're staying with Naomi. But Naomi says, no. Return home, my daughters. And it's interesting at this point that she calls them my daughters, because technically they are daughters-in-law. They're not her daughters. But they're so close and they've shared so much of life together, there's such a close bond that Naomi now looks at these 2 young women as her daughters. And she says, "Daughters, let me give you some motherly advice. Go back home. Don't stay with me. Your life will be better in Moab. You'll have a better chance of finding a new husband if you stay in Moab. You're young, you're beautiful. Go back home and just let this old woman go back to Israel all by herself." So that's what she's going to try to convince them to do. And to do that, she's going to ask some rhetorical questions in this first argument. And the first rhetorical question is, why would you come with me? Now, if you just look at the question, it seems like she's asking them to come up with all the positive benefits of staying with her. Why would you come with me? Let's have some great answers of all the benefits of staying with me. But that's really not what she's saying. She's saying, why in the world would you ever want to stay with me? In other words, she wants them to think of all the negative things that could happen to them if they stayed with her. So this is a rhetorical question. Why in the world would you ever want to stay with me? Meaning you don't want to stay with me. In fact, we could look at that and say, it is foolish for you to come with me. You would be much better off in your own country. So that's the first question. And then the second question is really strange. Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? And this in many ways is a strange question. In many ways it's an absurd question, and it assumes some things. Three things, actually. First, it assumes that Naomi is capable of bearing a child, even though she's been a widow for now at least 10 years, and she has no interest in getting married again. So when she says, am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? And the answer is no. So why would you want to stay with me when I can't have any more sons who could eventually become your husbands once again? The second thing it assumes is she is the only source from which they can find a new husband. And why would she think that? Well, if they go back with her to the land of Israel, there's this little thing in Israel called the Law of Moses. And all the Israelites are supposed to follow the Law of Moses. It's the covenant between God and the people of Israel. And part of that Law of Moses basically says to the Israelites, don't marry foreigners. So Naomi's thinking, if they go back to Bethlehem with me, is there an Israelite man in Bethlehem who would be willing to marry a foreign woman when the Law of Moses says they're not supposed to? And she's thinking, no, there's not. So the odds of these women finding a husband in the land of Israel is pretty slim to none. So Naomi's saying, I can't provide another son that you can marry, and I don't think there's too many Israelites who are willing to marry Moabite women. Then the third thing is that even if she could get pregnant right away, it would be 20 years before her sons would be old enough to marry these women. And 20 years from now, these women may be too old for these young boys to marry. In fact, they may be so old that they're past the age of being able to get pregnant and have children. So this whole thing is pretty hopeless and impossible. And what Naomi is saying is, girls, ladies, I can't help you. If you come with me, there's nothing I can do for you. And it's interesting that in English, in the NIV translation, in verses 11, 12, and 13, the word husbands is mentioned 3 times. In the Hebrew, it's actually mentioned 4 times. So what do Naomi's daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, really need? They need a husband. I mean, this is the ancient world. This was not the age where single women can make it on their own. They need a husband. And what Naomi is saying is, I can't provide you a son who can become your husband. So really, I'm of no value to you. I can't solve your problem. And that's the first argument. The second argument's in verse 12. And again, she starts out by saying what she wants them to do. Return home, my daughters. That's what I want you to do. Just go home. I am too old to have another husband. So that becomes her first argument. In many ways, in her first argument, she asked the rhetorical questions. In this second argument, she's going to answer her own rhetorical questions. And she begins by saying, I'm too old to get married again. Now, if we calculate the years and make an educated guess, Naomi's in her early 50s. But in the ancient world, that makes her a senior citizen. and she's beyond the age of bearing children. Now, today, a woman in her 50s, she can get married again, no problem. But back in the ancient world, especially if you could not produce children, you were kind of looked upon as somebody that the men don't want to marry. Because carrying on the family line and having sons was so important back in the ancient world. So Naomi's saying, listen, I'm too old to have another husband. So why do you want to hang out with me? And then she's going to present this case. This is the best case scenario that I can give you. And it ends in failure. So here's the best I can do for you. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, so I'm going to get married today, okay? Hypothetically, I'm getting married today. And then I'm going to give birth to sons, like twins. One for each of you. And that's 9 more months down the line. Would you wait until they grew up? I mean, come on, ladies. You're not looking for a husband in 20 years. You're looking for a husband like in the next 6 months to a year. You want a husband right away. You don't want a husband 20 years from now. So the best I can offer you isn't any good. And would you remain unmarried for them? In other words, are you just going to remain single for the next 20 years waiting for these guys to grow up? That's not what you want to do. So the best I have to offer you ends in failure. There's nothing I can do for you. So that's basically her first argument. I can't help you find another husband. Her second argument's going to come in this third thing that she's going to say to them. Not only can't I help you, but you don't want to end up the person I've become. So don't follow me, because if you follow me, you may end up as I am, and that's not going to be any good for you. So she begins that third and final argument by saying, no, my daughters. You're not going to wait. You don't want to wait. It is more bitter for me than for you. So Naomi begins to express how she feels for the first time. She's bitter. She's sour on life. And life has become more bitter for her than it is for them right now. Now, for a woman back in the ancient world, your success means that you get married and you give birth to a son so that your husband has someone to leave the family line to. And Naomi did that. She got married to Elimelech. She gave her husband 2 sons. But now her husband has died, and her 2 sons have died. So Naomi looks at her supposed success in life and says, I can't get married again, can't get pregnant again. Life for me is now bitter. But you, Orpah and Ruth, you're young. You can get married again. And you can give birth to a son for your husband. So life is bitter for me, but not so much for you. But if you stay with me, you may end up as bitter as I am. So don't stay with me. And then she goes on to say something interesting. Because the Lord's hand has turned against me. For the first time in this story, Naomi's going to express how she feels about what's happened to her. She's lost her husband. She's lost both sons. In essence, she's lost it all for a woman in the ancient world. And it's interesting that she blames God for the whole thing. She doesn't say this is a result of misfortune fate, or bad luck. Naomi knows enough about the God of heaven, the God of Israel, Yahweh, that she understands that He's in control of everything. And we understand that too. So if bad things have happened to me, God had something to do with it. And today we often like to say God didn't necessarily cause the bad, but He certainly allowed the bad to happen. But either way, He's connected with it because He's God. And we can't blame it on luck. We can't blame it on fate. It's God who made this happen. And at the same time, she realizes that she, in essence, is a victim of the hand of God, the Lord's hand. And the Lord's hand refers to His irresistible power. Meaning, God did this and I couldn't do anything about it. It's at this point that she also says, we didn't really do anything wrong to bring this on ourselves. Now, there's a lot of people who like to read into the story and say she did. She doesn't blame her husband for moving them from Israel to Moab. She doesn't do that. She doesn't blame her two sons for marrying Moabite women. Because actually, Naomi loves her daughters-in-law. If she had blamed her son for marrying these Moabite women, Naomi would have nothing to do with these Moabite women at this point in the story, but that's not how she feels. She loves them. She wants the best for them. So, according to Naomi, we have no big sin to confess. This bad stuff just happened to us. And as we're reading this from her perspective, we're probably thinking about Job. And perhaps we should. Because here's a man who was righteous in God's eyes, who obeyed God, kept the commands, did everything right he could possibly do, but his life turned out worse than even Naomi's. He loses his family, he loses his business, he loses his health. And Job's thinking, why? I did nothing to deserve this. And then Job has 3 friends show up. And Job's 3 friends say, okay, Job, all this bad stuff, you did something wrong. So confess up, buddy. Tell us what you did. And Job said, I didn't do anything. And in fact, it's interesting how the ancients were willing to express their frustration with God, perhaps a little bit more than we're willing to. Because Job said, you know what I really want to do? I want to take God to court, and I'm suing Him for being unjust to me. And here's Naomi saying, God has been unfair to me too. But here's the interesting part. Naomi is wrestling with what God allowed to happen to her. But at the same time, she believes in God. And she knows she has to somehow make sense of this in relationship with God. What Naomi doesn't say is, you know what? The Lord's hand is turned against me, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to worship Him anymore. I'm going to worship Baal from now on. No, she doesn't say that. Because she knows that Yahweh is the one true God. So she's stuck dealing with the one true God who has supposedly turned His hand against her. And she's got to make sense of this. She's got to be mad at God and believe in Him at the same time. Ever been there? Because when bad stuff happens to us, we can't say, just got unlucky. Or that was fate, or that was misfortune. No, I've got a relationship with God, and I know somehow God's involved in that somehow. But I'm not happy with what He's allowed to happen, but at the same time, I have to continue to believe in Him and put my trust in Him. And that's what Naomi's left with. And that's what Job was left with. And so too the sons of Korah. And they wrote a psalm about it that I want to read part of that to you. It's Psalm 44. And in Psalm 44, the sons of Korah are going to express that same frustration. And I want to read Psalm 44, verses 17 through 26, the end. And here's what they say. They're saying to God, "All this came upon us, though we had not forgotten you. We had not been false to your covenant. Our hearts had not turned back. Our feet had not strayed from the path, but you crushed us and made us a haunt for jackals. You covered us over with deep darkness. If we had forgotten the name of our God or spread out our hands to a foreign god, would not God have discovered it, since he knows the secrets of the heart? Yet for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. Awake, O Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? We are brought down to the dust, our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up and help us. Rescue us because of your unfailing love." In other words, God, we didn't do anything to deserve what you've done to us, but at the same time, God, we got to trust in your love to get us out of this, because we have no one else to truly trust, because you are the one and only true God. That's what Ruth is in Naomi's wrestling with. That's what Job wrestled with. That's what the sons of Korah wrestled with. And we wrestle with that today too. It's like, God, I'm mad at you, but you're still my God, and I still believe in you, and I still love you, and I still want to follow you. And the ancients kind of had a way of saying it a little more graphically than what we may be comfortable saying it, but it's the same thing. So, Naomi says to Orpah and Ruth, "I can't help you find another husband. And not only that, I'm a bitter, angry old woman. And do you really want to hang out with a bitter, angry old woman for the rest of your life? So why don't you just go back home and start your life over again?" And in verse 14, they wept aloud again. This takes us back to verse 9. This is after the first conversation. And they weep, and it looks like the two young widows are going to go back home. But the very next verse says they changed their mind and they're staying with Naomi. And it looks like that's going to happen again. They're going to have this big cry session, and then both daughters-in-law are going to say to Naomi, "We're going to stay with you after all." But surprise, at the end of verse 14, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. Orpah says, "You know what, Naomi, you're right. You can't help me. You know, even if you had another son, that's not going to work. And if you take me back to Israel, well, those Israelite guys are going to look at me as a foreigner, and they're not going to marry me. My best chance to find a husband is to stay right here in the land of Moab. So I'm going back home to my mom and my dad, and maybe they'll help me find another husband." So she kisses her goodbye. And in the ancient world, a kiss is a great way to say goodbye. They often did that. It was a nonverbal way of saying farewell. So she leaves. But Ruth clings to her. There's a contrast. This final decision between the daughters-in-law has been made, it looks like. Orpah says goodbye, and Ruth clings to Naomi. So Orpah chooses to return to Moab, and Ruth chooses to return to Naomi. Orpah leaves, Ruth clings. And it's interesting that as Orpah now turns and heads toward Moab, she walks away from Naomi and Ruth, and she walks right out of the story. You know, if this was a play, we would see Orpah exit the stage, never to return. She leaves. But it's interesting that the writer of this story doesn't say she does anything wrong. It doesn't say that somehow she made a bad decision. Many try to say that she's an example, a negative example of unbelief. But it doesn't say that. In fact, at this moment in the story, Orpah is the good daughter-in-law. She listens to her mother-in-law and does exactly what her mother-in-law tells her to do. She shows respect in her obedience. And you know who the problem child is? Yeah, it's Ruth. Because she's not convinced. She's hanging on. She's clinging as Orpah walks off into the sunset. Well, there's a third conversation. Maybe Naomi knew a little bit about baseball before it was invented. You know, because in baseball it's 3 strikes before you're out. Well, Naomi's got 2 strikes when it comes to Ruth, and she's going to try one more time. And so there's a third conversation. And in the third conversation, Naomi and Ruth become one, and Orpah walks out of the story. It's interesting in this particular third conversation, in verse 15, Naomi's going to try one more time to get Ruth to join Orpah and leave. But then in verses 16 and 17, Ruth gets to speak for the very first time in this story. And Ruth gives one of the classic speeches in the entire book. In fact, if there's one speech that's known from this book, this story, it's Ruth's speech in verses 16 and 17. And then by the time we get to verse 18, Naomi has no other choice but to concede. So verse 15 is Naomi's last argument. She says, "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go back with her." Now, if we can imagine, here's Ruth and Naomi standing there, and Orpah is leaving. And Naomi says, look, there goes your sister-in-law. She's made a good choice. Go after her. Go with her. That's what she says. It's interesting how the language has just changed. It's now your sister-in-law. I mean, Orpah, a couple of verses ago, was called a daughter. And earlier she was called a daughter-in-law. Now she's Ruth's sister-in-law. Naomi knows she'll never see her again. She's going back to the land of Moab. Naomi's going to Bethlehem in the land of Israel. They'll never see each other again. In fact, in this story, we're not told how things work out for Orpah. Does she meet a Moabite man? Does she get married? Does she have children? Does she live happily ever after? We don't know. Because she walked out of the story. We never hear. And chances are, Naomi never hears either. Communication wasn't so great in those days. They couldn't Facebook each other or text each other. Doesn't work that way. Your sister-in-law is going back. You need to go back too. And again, this whole emphasis in this entire chapter is return, or the NIV translates it, going back, go back. Those are the key words. One other thing that Naomi says, Orpah is going back to her people and her gods, which is kind of strange, especially reading it from a New Testament perspective. Back in the ancient world, back in this world that Naomi lives in, there are tribes, there are people groups, and every one of these groups had their own god. The Israelites, their God was Yahweh, the God that revealed himself to Moses. And in fact, the Israelites are called the people of Yahweh, people of the Lord. The Moabites are the people of Chemosh. That's their God. And in the minds of the ancients, every one of these groups had their own God. In every land, every geographical location, there was a God over that geographical location. So if you live in Moab, you live in the land of Chemosh. He's the God who controls everything in Moab. So if you want it to rain in Moab, you don't pray to Yahweh. You don't pray to Baal. You pray to Chemosh because he's over that land. Now, we talked a little bit last week that Yahweh is not limited. He can do anything he wants in any land he wants. So God can bless people in Moab if he wants to. And we learned from Daniel that God can show up in Babylon if he wants to. We know from Esther's story he can show up in Persia if he wants to. God is not limited by geography. But in the minds of the ancients, that's how they thought. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if Naomi would have said, your sister-in-law is going back to her people, and I pray that she continues to worship Yahweh, the God I told her about. From a New Testament perspective, we would want to hear that. But it seems to be for Naomi, it's okay if Orpah goes back to the Moabites and worships Chemosh, the God she knew growing up. And we're going, that's not good. Because we know there's only one true God. He happens to be the God of Israel. And how much did Naomi tell her daughter-in-laws about the God of Israel? We're not sure. Apparently not enough that she was hoping that Orpah would continue to worship Yahweh at this point in her life. So it's interesting how that ends. Now it's time for Ruth to make her final decision. She's standing there with Naomi. Sister-in-law is gone. Now she has to decide. Am I going to live in Moab or Bethlehem? Am I going to stay with Naomi, or am I going back to my own mother? Am I going to worship Yahweh, who I may not know hardly anything about? Or do I continue to worship this God, Chemosh, that I've grown up learning about? She has to make that choice. She has to make that decision. And her final decision is going to be in the form of a speech in verses 16 and 17. And it's almost a semi-poetic way of making her commitment. And this is the most famous speech recorded in the book of Ruth. Ruth replies. She's going to speak for the first time. She hasn't said a word that we know of up to this point. Ruth replies, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you." We could better translate that, "Would you please stop urging me to leave you and turn back from you?" Because she has heard all of these speeches. And let's face it, they were pretty persuasive. So persuasive that Ruth's sister-in-law took the bait and left. And Ruth is saying, stop urging me. Because it's draining on her. Naomi apparently is pretty persuasive after all. And Ruth is feeling all of this persuasion to go back and stay in Moab and just let Naomi go. But then she says, stop urging me to leave you. And we could translate that, abandon you. Because that's how Ruth feels about it. Ruth is saying, if I leave you now, it's like I'm abandoning you. And I can't do that. I can't abandon you. No. And not only that, this word turn back or return is back again. Normally it's returning to a place. Now it's returning to a person. To turn back from you. I can't turn back from you. I've got to stay with you. I can't stay in Moab. So, Naomi, please stop. I've heard all your arguments, and yeah, they make a lot of sense. And you're very persuasive, and you're really good in how you argue. But I can't leave you. Because if I leave you, I'm going to feel like I'm abandoning you. So in verse 14, Ruth clings to Naomi. In verse 16, Ruth says, I'm not going to abandon you. I cannot do that. Then she goes on to say, where you go, I'll go. And where you stay, I'll stay. Now, the interesting part of it is, from Ruth's perspective, she's going to Israel. She's going to Bethlehem, a city she's probably never heard of. She's going to the tribe of Judah, maybe a tribe she's never heard of. But Naomi, if that's where you're going, I'm going to go there too, even though I have no clue about what I'm getting into. And where you decide to lodge and stay, that's where I'm going to stay too. Even though, by the way, Naomi, where are we going to live when we get to Bethlehem? She doesn't know. She makes this pledge, this commitment to her mother-in-law, even though she has no clue as to what that means. It's like, I'll just go where you go. Interesting. Doesn't have any answers, but she's absolutely committed to her mother-in-law. She goes further. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Naomi's people, the Israelites. So Ruth says, I'll become an Israelite. I'll convert to becoming an Israelite. And your God, Yahweh, I'll worship him too, even though I may not know much about him. You know, preachers love to kind of jump on that last statement and say that this was kind of like a conversion story for Ruth. But really, it isn't. What she's really saying to Naomi is, whoever your God is, I'll worship him. So if Naomi would have said, you know what, I'm going to go back to the land of Canaan and worship Baal, Ruth would have said, great, I'm going with you. I'll go back to the land of Canaan and worship Baal with you. At this point, she really doesn't know much about the God of Israel. She'll figure it out as the story goes on. But at this point, her commitment is absolutely to Naomi. And we have to ask the question, why? It's surprising. Naomi has said, there's no advantage in going with me. Naomi's not rich. At this point, Naomi's not sure that the property she left in Israel back in Bethlehem, she can reclaim again. She may be homeless when she gets back to Bethlehem. But Ruth seems to say, I don't care. Still going with you. No guarantees, but I'm going. And then there's Naomi. I mean, this poor woman has been through tragic circumstances, and it's weighing on her. As verse 13, she blurted it out. The God I serve is the God who seems to have turned against me. But I'm going back and I'm going to still serve him. She's overcome with grief. Hanging out with somebody like that is going to be demanding and stressful. You ever tried to help somebody who felt like the weight of the world had fallen on them and they're blaming absolutely everybody they can think of? And you're there trying to be a friend of encouragement. That's not easy. That's stressful. That's demanding. But Ruth says, I don't care. I'm still going. So Ruth's going to go with Naomi into an unknown future with no guarantees of a happy ending. Ruth could end up Naomi, an old, bitter woman who's angry at everybody. She could. That could be how the story ends. They get back to Bethlehem. Ruth can't find a husband. In fact, people look at her and go, why is there a Moabite living with Naomi? Who let the Moabite into town? I mean, she could find that she becomes a very lonely, oppressed person for the rest of her life, with no husband, no children, and she can die a bitter old woman, just like Naomi. That could be how the story ends. If you've read the book, you know that. It's not how the story ends, but it could. And here they are on their way back from Moab to Bethlehem, and Ruth is not about to be deterred. I'm going with you. I don't care what happens. Well, you have to say that's a great example of love and devotion. Because, I mean, that's the only thing I can think of that would be Ruth's motivation for wanting to do this. She cares so deeply about her mother-in-law that she's not about to let her experience the rest of her life alone. It's a great example of love. Well, next week we'll find out what happens when they arrive in Bethlehem. It's been over 10 years. Who will recognize Naomi? And what will Naomi say about what's happened over the past 10 years? Well, we'll find out. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. It's a story that anytime difficulty, tough decisions come into our life, it's one we can relate to. It's a story of brokenness, emptiness. It's a story of tragedy and how to deal with it. And Father, it's a story of how to relate with you when you're not doing things the way we want you to do things. Knowing that we can't let go of you, but we're not so happy with you either. How do we deal with that, God? How would you want us to deal with that? Father, it's a story about life, real tragedy, real difficult situations, making decisions without knowing how the story's going to end up. Stepping out in faith, stepping out in hope, but not knowing what's going to happen next. It's a story about life, real life, the life we live every single day. So, Father, help us to wrestle with these things too, and help us to have faith in you too, even when you're not doing things the way we like you to do things. I pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.